My name is Joanna Elmy. I'm a journalist, researcher, 5 years of experience working with analyzing what I call manipulative content. I have a degree in communication science. My research centered around journalistic dissemination of uh, falsehoods via checking information, something that turned out to be an voluntary and undetermined effect of journalists elevating misinformation when they check it on their much larger platforms. I've done a lot of analyst work in applied research for companies like Zint Network, the Institute for Strategic Dialogue, and other organizations. And in addition to that, in Bulgaria, I am a writer and I'm an English lit major. So today I'm sort of going to combine all these hats and tell you about a little something that I have sort of noticed and is a part of my ongoing research. And I'm going to dive into this with some pretty current topics. So these are headlines from this summer in one case, and a little more recent one from The Hill, and they deal with the percentage of Republicans who believe that Biden's 2020 win was not true. They believe that the election was stolen from Donald Trump. And these sort of like narratives were being perpetrated and reinforced shortly before the US elections, as you can see in these two headlines and excerpts of articles. Then we are going to move on to Twitter, where we have Matt Walsh, who's like a right-wingy sort of personality, tweets a lot of controversial statements and then calls them a joke. So this is what he says now, and that was yesterday. So one day after the elections, that the left, which means the Democratic Party of the US, will now claim that the election was stolen from them, which some people on the left and probably possibly quite a lot of bots and trolls were perpetrating these like narratives as the results were coming in. On the other side, you see another conspiratorial tweet that uses the results from this election in order to confirm that the last one was stolen from the Republican Party. Nevertheless, here you see a wonderful flag which sort of perpetrates this belief. You see a CNN article as well, which sort of summed up how the Republican campaign was sort of laying the ground to contest the results once they were in, because again, probably even the Republican Party didn't expect that Trump was going to win a second term in office. And yet, when the results came in, and this is the picture that you see of the 45th and 47th president of the United States, when the results they come in, the Republicans accepted them because they were in favor of their candidate. And as a lot of sane people, a lot of people would ask themselves, how can these contradictive narratives coexist? Okay, how can we believe that an election process is undemocratic, and yet at the same time, when the results come in and they do favor our candidate, we accept them immediately and don't question them and don't contest them at all? Now, the answer, surprisingly, in my opinion, is not to be to be discussed in, or to we are not to seek the answer in communication science so much as we are to seek it in literature. So I am going to tell you about two kinds of storytelling that a lot of English speaking people, English literature people know. And they are the paratactic and the syntactic type of storytelling. Paratactic, for those of you who have children, you are probably very familiar with this type of telling a certain sort of narrative, right? So it's the speech of young kids. It's very non-causal. I went to the gym, they had cake there. We don't question these as contradictory. This is just what happened. I'm trying to like make a point because I want cake and my mom is going to the gym. I want to go with her. I went to the gym. They had cake there. This is the way they sort of process and the way they attach pieces of information that relate to the world. Paratactics storytelling represents ideas in this sort of like flow without connecting them with any sorts of like logical connectors like because, therefore, and so on and so on. And this is because the ideas of this type of storytelling aren't logically connected. The audience is not bothered by this lack of connection between these segments, and the audience is not looking for such connection because what they are interested in is what is the point of the story that the speaker is trying to tell. Therefore, the audience isn't checking for consistency and isn't bothered by contradiction. And this type of paratactic storytelling is actually very common in the oral tradition, which has been our tradition for the majority of human history, which is what makes it so problematic and so hard to work with if we try to apply our usual approach to information, which is what we do when we consider information in syntactic storytelling. So this is the opposite. Here we have relationship, causality, consequence. It usually demands higher cognitive capacity, and this is why it's very common when we read books. It's impossible to read a continuous narrative and have this glaring contradiction come right in the middle of it. This is because the causal relationship is explicitated and explicated, and there's logical coherence to the entire narrative. And the audience is very much interested in that. The audience is looking for a coherent explanation for what is happening in this type of storytelling. The example that I'm going to give you is Genesis. Surprisingly for some of you or not, the Genesis account of creation actually contains two creation narratives, and they are placed right one after the other depending on which one which sort of copy you're going to read, but usually this is the case. So in the first kind of like narrative, the earth is created in 6 days by God, and humans are created at the end on day 6. But right after it, we have another account of creation in which God creates man initially before everything else. So these were two separate sort of like narratives that were orally told to audiences differently. But when the text was combined in a paper body, or, like as we know it now, they were combined and they slowly became the Genesis version that we know today. And you may ask yourself why this was the case, apart from just the oral tradition, which is very difficult to keep track of. It's because there's two ways of underscoring importance, right? One is by placing something at the beginning of a narrative, and the other one is placing it at the end towards culmination. And Genesis covers both these grounds purely at the level of structure of the narrative. The other example that I've prepared for you is Hesiod. So Hesiod gives us two stories on the origin of the human race. One is about the 5 ages of men, and we have the so-called like races of men who succeed one after the other, and they're able to reproduce. Therefore, we would have like men and women in these races who would give the next generation. But in another story, Hesiod claims that for a long time only men existed until Zeus punished them by creating women, right? We cannot tell to which timeline and to which of Hesiod's account Pandora belonged in, because this is not the point. So sort of checking this information or this type of information is usually pretty useless, because this type of narrative isn't trying to tell you an account of what actually happened. It's trying to make a point. It's trying to use this very powerful and very primal like metaphor in order to convey certain information. In this case, in Hesiod's case, it's that the world is worse than it was before, that we are a part of the last race of men, and we are the most inferior, corrupt, and whatever else you would like to call it. In the second, it's to prove that women are, in his view, evil. So these two were not ever meant to be together in like an account in a sort of like syntactic way that we're used to consuming information today as in now like educated people. And the audience back then wouldn't mind the inconsistency because, as I said, the goal isn't to be consistent, it's to convey a certain point, which is why very often on the internet or when you talk to people who are close to you, you will probably hear this sentence or some variation of it. It may not be true, but I still believe it. And this is where paratactic comes in. We know from a lot of research that one of the most effective way for any information to reach us is word of mouth. What our colleagues are going to say to us, what our friends are going to say to us, what people who we trust and we know are going to say to us. The other very easy way is, of course, on our own, YouTube, which is very much oral tradition. It's podcasting, which is very much oral transmission of information, where we have much more paratactic than syntactic sort of like narratives. This works also very well with our confirmation bias. Now, confirmation bias in a lot of research is usually a very good predictor for like misinformation vulnerability. So if somebody has like a higher coefficient of confirmation bias, it's much more likely for them to believe statements that confirm their own views. So this is all the evidence that they ignore, and this is all the evidence that they choose to believe. This is like the sum up of confirmation bias, although I'm sure most of you already know that. This is a little bit of research just to sort of back up what I'm trying to say about confirmation bias, which is one of the like most reliable predictors for vulnerability for misinformation. So paratactic storytelling is basically our most ancient and primal way of understanding the world. This is the way we have told each other what is going on for years and years and years, centuries. And it's also extremely conducive to confirmation bias and vice versa, because this sort of oral transmission, we can pick what we like, we can leave the rest, and also there's no cohesiveness and no causality, which is why the like narrative that the elections were stolen can coexist with our candidate winning without there being any problem between the two narratives on a purely cognitive level. On a purely like logical level, we're not talking about this right now, which is what makes paratactic storytelling excellent manipulation technique. And when we talk about how do we solve that, what interventions can we adopt in order to challenge this? Research shows and sort of support this idea that the best ways to counter manipulative content is to offer alternative stories for our audiences. So alternative narratives that they could comprehend and internalize. And the like most sort of positive ways to do that is by supporting local journalism and media literacy education. Checking information can work, but has very like modest long-term consequences. And so do all these other strategies. So this is a like meta an analysis of them that I've linked as a source in the presentation. So as you see, all these other like interventions, they work and they're important, but offering an alternative explanation, offering an alternative line, plot, legend, you know, an alternative myth is what helps most with tackling this kind of content. And that's research across the board at this time. So the best approach remains to create a different kind of narrative. And I would, from my personal experience, from all the like research that I have read, I would recommend to not just debunk or argue, but provide alternative explanations and causal links, causal narratives that explain why the world is the way it is. Empower local people, journalists, influencers, community leaders who can engage in this type of communication with the people you're trying to target or help or inform about a certain issue. Educate audiences and teach them that not all sort of narrators are equal, not all stories are equal. Look beyond this kind of like narrative and content and ask yourself, what is the point that the speaker is trying to convey, and how is he trying to convey it, and what can I do to sort of convey that same point with information that's appropriate and checked and that is not manipulated in some way, and how do I challenge it without eliciting reactance in the other person. That was me. I think I was well within my time. This was a little bit quick because I was trying to sort of stay within my bounds. But if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to email me. I'm also on social media under the same handle, pretty much everywhere, I think, unfortunately. So please don't hesitate to inquire and to follow up on this. I will be very happy to talk about this a little bit more with you on any platform or via email.
Thank you, Joanna, for bringing these perspectives, oral versus written, and also giving this recommendation. Actually, I was wondering, would you recommend to the good guys who want to fight disinformation, actually to use the oral tactics? Oral, not coherent, but strongly emotional, but presenting even themselves as heroes for the good or something like this, because we are going to talk about evil and monsters in the political life that are using especially this tactic. Do you think that it could be it could be approached with the same model, but by the good ones?
I believe so. I believe so. So across the US election right now, one of the biggest demographics that is of interest is that of young men, Gen Z men, who are very much influenced by this type of storytelling technique. And most like namely podcasting and YouTube. Now the problem is, I think, for the good guys, as you call them, that we really powerfully believe that the truth always has to be boring, right? The truth is full of information. We give all the data, and we somehow want of people who are much less educated than us, much less interested in it than we are, and much less a lot of other segments, that I'm not gonna have the time to name. Uh, we expect from these people to sort of receive this information unquestionably and be compelled by it. Whereas in reality, even we ourselves aren't that compelled by it. So, what I would urge everybody to consider is that the truth doesn't have to be boring. The legitimate information doesn't have to be boring. And it's just as important not only to discover the data and the truth, but to learn to present it in a way that is compelling for audiences. Because as journalists and as experts, academics, we have largely sort of abandoned that to a sort of like a higher in expectation of very like rational actors who are going to engage with our content. And that has never been the case in the history of humankind, unfortunately. So totally, I would say, embrace this 100%.
Well, questions and reactions from the panel. Maybe Garvan first, because he didn't.
Yeah, I just wanted to say that because I don't know whether you're continuing this and you're not in the room here, I have a particular visual storytelling project in Bulgaria that I'd love to talk to you about. Maybe you could even join it.
Awesome. Yes, email me, please, and I would love to chat. Yes.
If it is something like orgasm via truth, I could be also interested.
Let me share my email sort of again, because I think I sort of exited that quickly so I can see your wonderful faces, which I very much would prefer to my presentation. But here it is. That's the email, and that is the, yes.
It's not there.
Okay. No. Yeah, but maybe in the chat.
Oh, perfect. I will do it in chat.
Yeah, because we see something else, just the logo of the conference. That, But
Give it to me. That's easier.
yeah.
I take the responsibility.
Okay, we will find a way your emails to be shared. More questions?
I'm easily discoverable, unfortunately. So yeah.
Joanna, there is a question to you from Kate.
Thanks for the super interesting presentation. I was just wondering if you've used this analysis to look at Trump's so-called weave, where he's rambling incoherent, whatever they are, group therapy sessions happen. So is this a legitimate strategy that he's employing consciously, or is it just the way he talks, in your opinion?
The weave, unfortunately, I have not studied because it was fairly like recent input of his that he does that, which we all sort of knew. I think that's another technique, which is called like information overload, where you just overload your audience with information and you just don't quit talking and talking and talking until they're compelled and sort of like listening to what you have to say. Now, I'm not sure how successful this is, because after every like rally, there are a couple people who are like filming everybody leaving early. So I don't know how effective the weave is. I know that the like myth that he's created for himself is probably what wins him much more people than his actual like ramblings. Now, I don't know of a Trump supporter who actually listens to Trump, and I know quite many of them. And I see that they're compelled much more by the myth than by the man himself.